Hello and welcome to Tucking It Up. My name is Tuck and I'd like to play around with makeup. Today what I'm going to do is a little bit probably I guess unusual, something that I don't really do too often because there's lots of people who are much better at it, but I didn't see that many videos for this palette. So I'm going to do a swatch slash first impressions slash comparison video. Anyway, so it's going to be for the industrial palette from Isamaya Beauty. Isamaya Beauty is the new makeup line from Isamaya French, who's really, really cool. I could gush over her work for a long, forever, but I won't. So you can tell, right, my bias going into this. I was very excited for the release of this palette, and, just to give, I guess, the conclusion away, so you can tune out for the rest of the video, I really like this palette. And I'll get into why in just a bit. Before we get into the product details, I should mention this, the eyes today were done using this palette completely. So this industrial palette, actually the whole Isamaya Beauty line is priced at the high end, so kind of comparable to Natasha Denona, Pat McGrath, that sort of level. So this eyeshadow palette comes with 14 shades, and it retails for $115. This sort of, I guess, color story from Isamaya Beauty, this is the kind of thing I really respond to. So as you can see in that picture that I just popped up, this is kind of more of a green palette. There's a little bit of gold in there, there's some black, and some like gray slash silver, but it's kind of predominantly, I would say, green. And the color story, the concept behind this color story is that, right, like based on the name, you can guess, it's supposed to be like sort of industrial, sort of, I hate to use the word grungy again, but like grungier, dirtier colors. And I really like that. And so, yeah, let's get into the swatching then. Apologies if I stumble over the names. I'm still like not super familiar with them. And then for some of them, the link between the name and the shade is, let's say, tenuous at best. Okay, this first one is a little bit better though. It's leather, and as you can see, it's basically a matte black. And it comes in a putty or cream to powder formula. You can see it's not like super opaque from the swatch, which is fine with me. You can build it up, and I like that. The second shade is Sweat, and so this is kind of more of an iridescent topper shade. I used it in the look today. You can see it on my eyes and on my lips. I really, really like the shade. I think it's very pretty. The next shade is Brass, and it's what the name says. You could also call it a copper shade, just really pretty metallic shade. Next we have Grip, and Grip has a little bit of iridescence to it. You can see it's sort of a cooler green. I really like the shade. I think it's very pretty. In the official quote-unquote video, Isamaya described this as being like a beetle green, and I really agree with that. Next up, we have Motor. I've actually used Motor today in this look. It's kind of that green shade that you see predominate. And next we have Machine, which is a bright silver shade. To me, this almost has like a little bit of like a purplish tint to it when you see it reflected. I don't know, maybe it's just me. And the last shade in the first row is Cuprum, which is a dirty gold sort of shade. The first shade in the second row is Fetish, which is a little bit more of a traditional gold, I would say, or as close to a traditional gold as this palette gets. And I used it in the look today. It's not super bright, but it does give a nice effect, especially if you want gold, but not like super, super gold. We have Belt, which is a metallic brown. I used this yesterday in kind of a softer, more, I guess you could say, everyday kind of look. Next up, we have Flesh, which is more of a topper shade. It's pretty transparent. It kind of looks beigey, pinkish, kind of on the cooler side. After Flesh, we have Whip, and Whip is kind of a gunmetal slash sparkly black. I have that along the lower lash line today. Fun shade. What else can I say? It's a black or gunmetal it's not super easy to find, I think, a shade that's exactly like this. Next up, we have Diesel, which is kind of a really dark blue shade, almost like a black. The blue doesn't really come out unless you have a blue base. I'm wearing it today. It's the shade that's kind of closest to my upper lash line. I did use a blue pencil to really intensify that blue. And rounding out the set, we have Heat and Initiator. So Heat is kind of like, it's pretty transparent. I would say it's also kind of more of a little bit of a topper shade. It does give like a veil of color. It's sort of more on the peachy side. And then finally, Initiator is this really kind of like a bright, I guess you could say acidic green. All right, let's go ahead and do some comparisons. I'm going to just pick a couple of shades that I think are standouts and compare them to some Pat McGrath shades that I own. First is Sweat, and I'm comparing Sweat here to Astral White from Mothership 1 and Astral Ghost Orchid from Mothership 3. As you can see, they're not identical. I think Astral White actually is the closer one, but you know, if you wanted to replicate the effect of Sweat, you could just, and you have Astral White, it's going to be perfectly fine. Now I'm going to compare Initiator. Initiator, again, is this acidic green from the palette, and I'm going to compare it to Gigabyte from Mothership 3, I should say. In person, they look very different. I think on camera, they look a little bit more similar to each other, but I don't think they're dupes for each other or even that close necessarily, so there you go. The next comparison swatch that I'm going to do is for Grip. I'm comparing it here to Dragonfly from the Celestial Divinity palette from Pat McGrath. It's kind of not that close, but to me it gives like similar enough vibes. I think Dragonfly is a little bit warmer, right? It has that sort of more brown base to it. Next, I'm going to do Whip, and I have Whip along my lower lash line, as I mentioned, and I'm comparing it to Black Metal again from Mothership 3. Don't really see that they're that close. I mean, they're, again, if you didn't have the industrial palette, you want to create something similar to what I have on, you know, using Black Metal would be perfectly fine. Let's wrap up this video by just talking about my first impressions of this palette. As I mentioned up front, this is, you know, not a cheap palette, right? It's $115, but for me, it is worth the price because, like I said, I haven't felt this, I guess, jazzed or this enthused about a new makeup release in a really, really long time. I just really love the color story, and I think even if the shadows had a subpar performance, I would have maybe forgiven them that sin because I just liked the concept so much. But thankfully, you know, these perform at the level of what you would expect for if you're paying, you know, upwards of $100 for an eyeshadow palette. They go on smoothly. They, you know, some of the darker shades especially maybe are not as maybe opaque as you might get from a comparable shade from like Natasha Denona or Pat McGrath, but it's not that you can't build them up, right? It's just that they, you know, you have to layer them a little bit, but that's fine because sometimes with darker shades, if there's like so, like sort of, they pack such a punch, you know, on the first go, it can really make your life difficult if you accidentally like just go, you know, dip your brush in just a little bit too much. In terms of like longevity and stuff, I wore this, I wore this, you know, some of the shades from this palette yesterday for about 6 hours or so. I didn't really notice any fading or any fallout from, you know, sort of throughout the course of the wear. You know, maybe that was because of the eyeshadow primer that I use. It's the Wet n Wild eyeshadow primer. I love that primer. It makes every shadow that I've tried on it just last forever and, you know, just really stick well. One thing I will say about these shadows is that with that primer, a lot of the times I find that it makes blending out the shadow just a little bit more trickier, a little bit more difficult. It's not impossible by any means, but it does make the colors sort of stick to one place more. With these shadows, I didn't find that effect to be as pronounced. It was still relatively easy to get like really pretty smooth blends, but also a lot of these shades are, you know, metallic or they have some sparkle to them, which is a little bit easier to like blend out and create the illusion of like a uniform blend, I would say, than completely matte shadows. So take from that what you will. I guess my final thoughts are, you know, who do I think this palette is best for? I would say if you like kind of more edgy, more editorial, like color stories and vibes, you know, if you're someone who really responded well to Mothership 3 from Pat McGrath, this is the palette, I would say, for you. As you saw in the comparison swatches, there are some shades. It's not like at this point there's nothing in makeup, right, that's like super 100% unique. And so you can dupe, you even if you don't have exact dupes of these shades, you can do probably very similar looks, get very similar vibes. So if you don't want to spend the money, perfectly, there's nothing wrong with that, of course. For me, I was just excited to get this, and I love playing around with it. And I have a strong feeling I'm going to be using this palette quite a bit. And then the other thing that I just wanted to point out before we end is that this palette is more versatile, I think, than you might think at first, right? You look at it and you think, okay, I can really only do like more nighttime or evening sort of looks. But I don't think that's true, because if you want to go a little bit more neutral, you can. The amount of shades that you can, I guess, use for kind of a more traditional neutral look here are limited, but they're there, and that's actually the shades that I wore yesterday when I was kind of doing my sort of unofficial wear test. And I think they turned out, the picture wasn't great, but in real life, I think the look was really quite nice, in my opinion, and I really liked it. So thank you again for your time, and as always, take care, and bye!